The clock marked 11:45 p.m. when John, an experienced bus driver, began his last journey of the night on Route 307. The bus slid through the dark streets of the city, each streetlight an oasis of light among stretches of deep darkness. The route, almost always empty, seemed even more desolate that night. Bus stops paraded one after another, bathed only in the faint light of the street lamps, all empty. John felt a growing unease, a premonition he tried to ignore. The silence was broken only by the noise of the engine and the occasional creak of empty seats. He adjusted the rearview mirror, watching the road behind him, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. As the night progressed, a cold breeze began to seep through the cracks in the windows. John huddled in his uniform, trying to warm up, but the cold seemed to penetrate deeper than expected. As the bus entered increasingly isolated streets, the sense of desolation grew. The headlights illuminated fragments of sidewalks and graffiti-strewn walls, creating shadows that danced to the rhythm of the journey. At each stop, John looked hopefully towards the door, but no one got on. The echo of his own thoughts began to weigh on him, and the loneliness of that nighttime route became increasingly palpable. Suddenly, at one of the less lit stops, John felt a chill run down his spine. The silence was so profound he could hear his own heart beating rapidly. It was then that, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure moving swiftly into the bus, silently, without paying the fare. John turned abruptly, but saw no one. He walked to the back of the bus, inspecting each seat. Nothing, just the sound of his own breathing and the nervous throbbing of his temples. He returned to the wheel, trying to convince himself it had been just a trick of the light or a fleeting shadow. But the discomfort remained, an unwanted presence that seemed to coil in the cold air. As the bus approached the end of the route, John tried to keep his focus on the road, but his mind wandered, restless. The tales from other drivers about apparitions and unexplained occurrences on that line began to make sense, whispering in his memory. With each new turn, the interior light of the bus briefly flickered, casting everything into darkness before coming back on. Those brief moments of darkness seemed to linger, as if something or someone played with the light to observe him. John frequently glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting, half fearing to see something that defied logic, and in one of those glances he saw it. On the last bench, reflected in the mirror, there was someone smiling at him, a smile that did not reach the cold eyes which watched him with a disturbing intensity. At the first few stops, no one entered the bus, but at the third, John noticed something strange. A man sitting at the back of the bus. He didn't recall stopping for anyone to get on. His heart raced, peering into his rearview mirror. John tried to get a better look at the figure. The man was dressed in an old-fashioned coat, his hat pulled low over his eyes, obscuring his face. Each time the bus passed under a streetlight, the man's features seemed to shift, never quite coming into clear view. John's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his mind racing with questions about who the man could be and how he had gotten on the bus. The silent figure at the back did not move, not even when the bus jerked around corners or rattled over potholes. John tried to focus on his driving, but his thoughts kept returning to the mysterious passenger. He thought about asking the man for his ticket, yet something held him back. A chilling sense of dread that clawed at his instincts, telling him to keep his distance. The bus's interior was quiet, too quiet, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint hiss of the heating system. The usual clatter of an urban night seemed to fade away, leaving only the eerie silence that enveloped the bus like a dense fog. As more stops came and went without anyone else getting on or off, John's unease grew. He glanced at the mirror again, only to find the man's seat empty. His breath caught in his throat. Had he imagined the passenger? Just as he began to calm himself, Thinking he had indeed been seeing things, he heard a soft thud from the back of the bus. Slowly, he turned his head, heart thudding painfully against his ribs. The man was no longer on the seat. Instead, he stood in the aisle, staring forward with an unsettling intensity. The dim light flickered, briefly illuminating the man's face, a gaunt visage with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom. John's fear escalated as the passenger began to move toward him. Each step was slow, deliberate. The sound of his shoes hitting the floor was unnervingly loud in the silent bus. John wanted to speak, to demand what the man wanted, but his voice was stuck in his throat. His eyes darted to the doors, considering a desperate escape, but he knew he couldn't abandon the bus. The man continued his steady approach, each step echoing in John's ears like a drumbeat, counting down to something inevitable and terrifying. As he neared the driver's seat, the lights flickered again, casting shadows that danced across the walls, making the night seem alive with whispering specters. John attempted to break the disturbing silence with a cautious greeting. "Good evening." His voice echoed slightly in the empty bus. The man did not respond, his gaze fixed outside the window, watching the darkened city pass by. His clothes seemed out of another era, worn and faded, clinging to his thin frame. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent under the sparse light of the bus's overhead lamps. The way he sat, motionless and silent, sent a shiver down John's spine. Something about him was unsettling, not just his appearance, but the very air around him felt colder, as if he brought a chill from another world into the bus. As John's eyes returned to the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silence had grown oppressive, heavier. The usual sounds of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the muted roar of the bus engine and the occasional splash from puddles under the tires. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, still staring out the window, never blinking, never moving. John felt a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. Why wouldn't the man speak? Was he a threat? The questions piled up in his mind, each one feeding his anxiety. The more he thought about the passenger, the more he felt an inexplicable dread creeping over him. Determined to resolve the unsettling atmosphere, John spoke again, this time with a bit more volume. "Is there a specific stop you need?" he asked, trying to sound casual and professional. Still, the man did not respond, did not even acknowledge his presence. It was as if John was speaking to a ghost, an apparition that could see through the mortal world without being a part of it. The silence returned, even more palpable after John's attempted intrusion into it. He felt a cold draft sweep through the bus, despite all windows being tightly shut. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The bus's interior lights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the man's hollow features. As the journey continued, the silence became a tangible presence in the bus, thick and suffocating. John found his eyes straying more frequently to the mirror, drawn to the spectral passenger whose presence seemed to dominate the space. Each glance revealed the man in the same position, an eerie statue of the night. The city's lights streaked across his face occasionally, illuminating the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the deep hollows of his eyes. John's mind raced with horror stories, heard from old colleagues, tales of haunted routes and phantom passengers who vanished as mysteriously as they appeared. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, each turn and stop punctuated by a growing sense of dread, wondering what this silent figure's presence portended for the remainder of his nocturnal route. At every turn the bus made, John cast nervous glances through the rearview mirror. The mysterious passenger remained motionless, his posture rigid and his expression unchanged, as if he were carved from stone. During a particularly lonely stretch of the route, a nearby Streetlight flickered abruptly, plunging the bus's interior into momentary darkness. When the light returned, John felt a knot form in his throat. The man now seemed to be sitting much closer than before, though John hadn't heard the sound of footsteps or the creaking of any seat. His heart pounded against his chest, each beat echoing in his mind with increasing alarm. John tried to keep his focus on the road, but the disturbing presence of the passenger behind him made it difficult to concentrate. The silence was now accompanied by a cold sensation that seeped through the corners of the bus, enveloping John like a freezing fog. He adjusted the heating, trying to dispel the cold, but the air that blew from the vents was inexplicably even colder. The temperature inside the bus seemed to drop with every kilometer traveled, a chill that did not match the autumn night outside. John huddled inside his coat, his eyes frequently returning to the mirror, where the passenger now seemed to be watching him directly. This exchange of glances through the mirror made John feel a chill run down his spine. The man's gaze carried an intensity that was almost palpable, cutting across the space between them like a physical touch. John tried to look away, to focus on anything other than those eyes, but something about the way the man watched him drew him back. He felt as if the passenger could see through him, reading his innermost thoughts and hesitations. The pressure of this unseen gaze made his head ache and his breathing become shallow. Finally, John couldn't take it anymore. He needed to hear the man's voice, needed to confirm that he was real and not some specter of his fatigued imagination. "Do you need anything?" John asked, his voice trembling as he tried to break through the barrier of silence and cold. There was no response. The passenger simply continued to look at him through the mirror, his face an immovable mask of disturbing calm. The lights of the bus flickered again, and in the brief darkness, John felt the weight of the man's gaze intensify, as if the darkness gave more power to his silent watchfulness. When the light returned, John realized, with a cold horror, that he was no longer alone in the driver's cabin. Relief washed over John as the bus finally reached its terminal stop. He took a deep breath, steeling himself to turn around and notify the passenger that they had arrived. But as he swiveled in his seat, his eyes met an empty bench. The cushion was still indented, as if someone had just risen from it. Puzzled and slightly unnerved, John stood up and walked down the aisle, checking each row to ensure he wasn't mistaken. There was no sign of anyone. The bus was as silent as it was empty, the only sound being the hiss of the idling engine in the quiet night. John's heart began to race again, the earlier feelings of dread creeping back as he considered the possibilities. He scrutinized the bus once more, looking under seats and even behind curtains, hoping to find some logical explanation or perhaps even a forgotten personal item that could prove someone had been there. But there was nothing. Just the echoing emptiness and the faint smell of cold metal mixed with the leather of the seats. As he made his way back to the driver's seat, a cold breeze brushed against his neck, making him shiver. He glanced around, half expecting to see the mysterious passenger reappear, but the bus remained resolutely empty. In the driver's seat, John couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that enveloped him. He checked the rearview mirror one last time, half hoping, half dreading to catch a glimpse of the man sitting there as before. But the reflection showed only the empty seats and the dimly lit interior of the bus. As he prepared to turn off the engine and close up for the night, the overhead lights flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows across the aisles. The sudden darkness was brief, but it was enough to make John's skin crawl. He hurried with the shutdown procedures, eager to leave the unsettling quiet of the bus. Once outside, the cool night air felt like a reprieve. John locked the bus and looked around the deserted terminal, the silence profound under the flickering streetlights. As he walked to his car, the sense of being watched returned, causing him to quicken his pace. Reaching his car, he threw one last look back at the bus. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing at the rear window of the bus, watching him leave. He blinked, and it was gone. With a shudder, he got into his car and drove off, the image of the empty, watching bus lingering in his rearview mirror. John felt the air grow heavier around him, a chill running down his spine. Something was wrong. He glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The passenger was still there, but he was no longer seated. He stood behind John, staring directly into the mirror. His eyes were voids, deep and dark as black holes that devoured the light. The man's pale face twisted into an impossible smile, stretching unnaturally wide, tearing his skin into grotesque fissures. John wanted to scream, but he couldn't. The air had vanished from his lungs. The bus's light flickered. For a second, the passenger disappeared. When the light returned, he was sitting in the driver's seat. John no longer felt his own body. His hands trembled, but they were strangers to him. His vision darkened. In the reflection of the mirror he saw, his own face was changing, eyes hollow, skin pale, the smile widening. The last thing he heard was the sound of the engine starting on its own. The bus departed, empty, and never stopped again. As the bus moved on, driven by no one John could see, he felt detached from reality. The streets outside blurred past, the normal sounds of the night strangely muffled as if underwater. The figure in the driver's seat, whom John had seen in the mirror, now seemed just a shadow. Every time John blinked, it appeared to shift, morphing subtly, becoming less like the passenger and more like John himself. Panic clawed at his mind, but his body wouldn't respond. He was a prisoner in his own seat, watching helplessly as his doppelganger took control. The surreal journey continued, the landscape outside growing increasingly unfamiliar. The usual city landmarks were gone, replaced by dark, twisted versions of themselves. Trees bent at impossible angles, their shadows sprawling, like dark fingers across the road. Buildings loomed over the bus, their windows like glaring eyes watching its progress. John tried to recall the route, but his memory was as distorted as the reflection in the mirror. Every attempt to think clearly was interrupted by the chilling grin of the figure driving the bus, a grin that seemed to mock his plight. Finally, the bus slowed to a stop, but not at any recognized terminal. They were on the outskirts of the city, in a place where the streetlights were few and far between. The doors hissed open, but John couldn't move. He watched in the mirror as the figure that looked like him stepped off the bus, then turned to give one final, bone-chilling smile. It then disappeared into the night, leaving John alone in the darkness. The engine shut off abruptly, plunging the bus into silence. Outside, the wind whispered across the desolate landscape, and John sat frozen, unsure if he'd ever find his way back from this twisted reflection of reality.